December 17, 1944, 7 a.m., Büllingen, Belgium. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets like a shroud when the thunder of approaching tanks shattered the winter silence. American soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division's Quartermaster Company scrambled from their billets, many still in various states of undress, fumbling for weapons as German Panzer IV and Tiger II tanks materialized through the mist like steel apparitions emerging from hell itself. At the head of this armored column rode SS-Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, 29 years old and already the youngest regimental commander in the Waffen-SS. His Kampfgruppe, consisting of 4,800 men and 600 vehicles stretched in a column 25 kilometers long, had been driving westward for nearly 36 hours as the spearhead of Hitler's desperate Ardennes Offensive. They were 16 hours behind schedule, dangerously low on fuel, and Peiper knew exactly what he was looking for in this small Belgian town, the American fuel depot that intelligence had marked on his operational maps. Within minutes, German infantry swarmed through Büllingen streets. Resistance collapsed almost immediately. Panzer grenadiers kicked in doors, rounded up bewildered American soldiers, and secured the town square. Peiper's men captured several Americans from the Quartermaster Company and a reconnaissance platoon of the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Most surrendered without firing a shot, overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of Germany's finest armored unit deep behind what they had thought were secure Allied lines. What the Germans found next would provide temporary salvation for their advance, but would ultimately crystallize a terrible realization about the war itself. 50,000 gallons of high-octane American gasoline, neatly stored in thousands of jerry cans and 55-gallon drums, arranged in orderly rows that stretched across several buildings and courtyards. The fuel was waiting to power Allied vehicles across Europe, part of a supply system so vast that this depot represented merely a small fraction of American logistical capacity in theater. Peiper immediately ordered his American prisoners, at gunpoint, to begin refueling the German tanks. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Here were American soldiers, hands raised in surrender, being forced to fuel the very machines that would carry the German offensive deeper into Allied territory, that would kill more of their comrades. The Tiger IIs, those 70-ton monsters that consumed fuel at the staggering rate of 2 gallons per mile, drank greedily from American supplies. Panzer IVs topped off their tanks, half-tracks filled their reservoirs. Panthers, Studgies, and countless support vehicles queued for their turn at this unexpected bonanza. For perhaps 90 minutes, Kampfgruppe Peiper enjoyed the luxury of unlimited fuel. Tank commanders who had been calculating every mile, rationing every gallon, now watched. Their fuel gauges climbed toward full for the first time in days. The relief was palpable throughout the German column. 50,000 gallons represented enough fuel to keep the Kampfgruppe mobile for another crucial phase of the offensive, perhaps enough to reach the Meuse River bridges that were their ultimate objective. But as Joachim Peiper stood in the town square, watching his vehicles refuel while his staff officers organized the systematic loading of additional fuel cans onto support vehicles, something profound was taking shape in his mind. This was not the first time he had encountered American supply operations, but the scale and organization of what he was seeing in this small Belgian town represented something far more significant than a tactical victory. The fuel depot at Büllingen was not some emergency forward dump hastily established for immediate tactical needs. The Americans had created a permanent logistics node, complete with proper storage facilities, organization systems, and enough fuel to support sustained operations by multiple divisions. The jerry cans were uniform, manufactured to precise specifications. The drums were standardized, easily transportable. Everything bore the marks of industrial mass production on a scale that Germany could no longer match. Peiper was no ordinary officer. He had served as Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant from 1938 to 1941, giving him exposure to the highest levels of strategic planning in the Reich. He had commanded armored units on the Eastern Front, where he had witnessed the seemingly endless resources the Soviets could bring to bear. He had fought in France and Belgium, watching American forces grow stronger with each passing month. He understood logistics, strategy, and the mathematics of industrial war in ways that many of his fellow combat commanders did not. And standing there in Büllingen on that cold December morning, watching American fuel flow into German tanks, Joachim Peiper understood something that many in the German High Command were still refusing to acknowledge. Germany had already lost the war. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but only how long the agony would continue. The fuel depot at Büllingen told a story that transcended its immediate tactical value. It spoke of an enemy with resources so abundant that they could station 50,000 gallons of high-grade fuel in a small Belgian town as a matter of routine supply operations. It represented a logistical system so sophisticated that fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment flowed from American factories through Atlantic convoys to French ports to Belgian depots with mechanical precision. It demonstrated industrial capacity so overwhelming that the United States could simultaneously fight a two-ocean war while feeding, arming, and fueling Allied forces on multiple continents. Germany, by contrast, had started the Ardennes Offensive with only enough fuel for 6 days of operations. The entire German plan for Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's grandiose scheme to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, depended upon capturing American fuel depots along the way. The German High Command had quite literally built their battle plan around the assumption that they could steal enough fuel from the Americans to sustain their offensive. They were planning to fight a mobile armored campaign using the enemy's logistics. This was not the strategy of a nation winning a war. This was the desperate gamble of a regime that had already lost. The mathematics of fuel consumption told the story with brutal clarity. The Tiger II tanks that formed the backbone of Kampfgruppe Peiper's striking power consumed 2 gallons of fuel for every mile traveled. At that rate, a Tiger II's fuel tank, holding approximately 180 gallons, provided a range of just 90 miles under ideal conditions. In combat, with the constant acceleration, deceleration, and maneuvering that characterized armored warfare, that range dropped to perhaps 60 or 70 miles. The 50,000 gallons captured at Büllingen could theoretically fuel Peiper's entire force for one more significant push. But only one, and then what? The plan called for capturing more American depots at Stavelot, at Spa, at dozens of other locations. But the Americans were already responding to the German offensive. They were evacuating depots, destroying fuel stocks, establishing defensive positions around critical logistics nodes. The 124,000 gallons that would be burned at Francorchamps to create a flaming roadblock. The millions of gallons evacuated from Spa before German forces could arrive. The elaborate system of depots and dumps being pulled back or defended by rapidly deploying American units. Peiper knew what his fellow officers either did not know or refused to acknowledge. Those American fuel depots represented just the visible tip of a logistical iceberg of staggering proportions. Intelligence reports, the ones that actually made it through to field commanders, indicated that the Americans had stockpiled millions upon millions of gallons of fuel in the European theater. First Army alone had access to depots containing over 3 million gallons in the Spa-Stavelot area. Depots near Liège held even more. The entire Allied supply system in Northwest Europe was measured not in thousands of gallons, but in tens of millions. And behind those European depots stood the entire industrial capacity of the United States. American refineries produced more petroleum products in a single month than Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry could generate in 6 months. The United States had access to oil fields in Texas, California, Oklahoma, producing crude oil that dwarfed anything available to the Axis. They had built pipelines, the Big Inch and Little Inch, specifically to move petroleum products from Gulf Coast refineries to East Coast ports for shipment to Europe. They had constructed tanker fleets to carry fuel across the Atlantic. They had created a supply chain of almost incomprehensible sophistication, moving fuel from wellhead to battlefield with systematic efficiency. Germany's fuel situation, by comparison, was catastrophic. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production capacity. The raids on Ploiești in Romania, beginning in August 1943, had crippled Germany's access to natural petroleum. By May 1944, when Allied bombers began targeting German synthetic fuel plants with systematic intensity, the Reich's fuel production began a collapse from which it would never recover. On May 12, 1944, 935 Allied bombers had struck multiple synthetic fuel plants across Germany. Before those attacks, synthetic fuel production had averaged 92,000 barrels per day. By September 1944, production had collapsed to just 5,000 barrels per day, a reduction of over 94%. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, had warned the Führer repeatedly that without fuel, German industry would cease functioning, German tanks would become immobile pillboxes, German aircraft would sit grounded on runways. "The enemy has struck us at one of our weakest points," Speer told Hitler after the May raids. "If they persist at it this time, we will soon no longer have any fuel production worth mentioning." The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, was being systematically grounded by fuel shortages. Pilot training had been slashed because there was no fuel for training flights. Average training hours for new German pilots had dropped from 240 hours in 1942 to just 110 hours in 1944. British and American pilots, by contrast, received an average of 350 hours of flight training. The disparity in quality was showing on every battlefield, in every engagement. German pilots were being thrown into combat with barely enough training to keep their aircraft in the air, facing Allied pilots with vastly superior training and vastly superior equipment. The German army had become increasingly dependent on horses. This was not a romanticized return to traditional cavalry warfare. This was the desperation of a military that could no longer fuel its trucks. Over 1.1 million horses served in the German military throughout World War II, the greatest use of equestrian transport in any conflict in history. In the Ardennes Offensive itself, German infantry divisions had used approximately 50,000 horses for transport and artillery movement. Horse-drawn columns had created massive traffic jams in the narrow forest roads, delaying armored units and creating bottlenecks that disrupted the entire offensive timetable. Joachim Peiper had witnessed this firsthand during his advance. His armored column, designed for rapid mobile warfare, had spent hours stuck behind horse-drawn artillery and supply wagons. The roads through the Ardennes, narrow forest tracks never designed for heavy military traffic, became clogged with a bizarre mixture of 1944's most advanced armored vehicles and 19th century transportation technology. The German military, heir to the Blitzkrieg that had conquered France in 6 weeks, was now moving supplies with the same methods used in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The contrast with American logistics was almost obscene. While German horses pulled ammunition wagons through muddy Belgian forest trails, American trucks, hundreds of thousands of them, moved supplies from depots to front lines with mechanical precision. The Red Ball Express, that legendary truck convoy system, operated primarily by African-American drivers, had hauled over 412,000 tons of supplies to advancing Allied armies between August and November 1944. The system operated around the clock, trucks rolling at speeds that would have been reckless in peacetime, maintaining a continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment. Individual American trucks could carry loads that required multiple horse-drawn wagons. They could travel at sustained speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour on decent roads. They didn't require feeding, resting, or veterinary care. They could operate in conditions that would kill horses. The 2.5-ton truck, the famous Deuce and a Half, that became the backbone of American military logistics, represented a technological and industrial achievement that Germany simply could not match in sufficient quantities. And those trucks were just one small component of the American logistical system. Behind them stood the Liberty ships, those mass-produced cargo vessels that carried supplies across the Atlantic. Behind those stood the American railroad system, moving goods from factories to ports. Behind that stood American industry itself, the factories, refineries, foundries, and plants that were producing war material at rates that defied comprehension. By 1944, American factories were producing approximately 96,000 aircraft per year. Germany's production peaked at around 40,000 per year. The United States manufactured over 88,000 tanks during the entire war. Germany produced approximately 50,000 panzers of all types. American shipyards launched more tonnage in 1943 alone than Japan built in the entire war. The statistics went on and on, each one telling the same story. America's industrial capacity was so vastly superior to Germany's that the outcome of the war had never really been in doubt once the United States entered the conflict. Peiper understood this. He had seen the intelligence assessments, the ones that made it through the Nazi propaganda apparatus. He had read the reports about American production capacity that German intelligence had initially dismissed as Allied disinformation, only to discover that the numbers were accurate, perhaps even conservative. He had watched from the Eastern Front as American Lend-Lease supplies transformed the Soviet military, providing trucks, food, fuel, and equipment that allowed the Red Army to sustain offensive operations across thousands of miles. The fuel depot at Büllingen was simply one more piece of evidence for a conclusion he had already reached. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. It was fighting a mobile war without adequate fuel. It was fighting an industrial war without sufficient industrial capacity. It was fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who could coordinate global supply chains with remarkable efficiency. The Ardennes Offensive itself embodied the fundamental contradiction of Germany's strategic position. Hitler had demanded one last great victory, one dramatic stroke that would split the Allies, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate. The plan required speed, surprise, and decisive action. It required fuel for hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, and tens of thousands of soldiers. It required sustained offensive operations across difficult terrain in winter conditions. Germany did not have the fuel to execute this plan. So, Hitler ordered his generals to proceed anyway, with instructions to capture American fuel depots along the way. This was not strategy. This was fantasy dressed up in operational planning. It was the military equivalent of a bank robber planning a heist by budgeting to steal the getaway car en route to the robbery. Senior German commanders had known this. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of the Western Front, had objected to the offensive from the beginning. He knew the mathematics didn't work. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, had warned that the plan hasn't got a damn leg to stand on and had no more than a 10% chance of success. SS-Obersturmbannführer Sepp Dietrich, commanding 6th Panzer Army, had complained bitterly about being expected to push an armored force through the rugged Ardennes in winter with a limited fuel supply. But Hitler had insisted. And German officers, caught between military reality and Nazi ideology, between professional judgment and survival under a totalitarian regime, had saluted and obeyed. So, Kampfgruppe Peiper had rolled forward with half the fuel it needed, counting on capturing American supplies. And at Büllingen, for one brief moment, the plan had worked. 50,000 gallons of American fuel captured intact. The vehicles refueled, the offensive could continue. Peiper's column could push onward toward Stavelot, toward Spa, toward the Meuse River bridges that represented his ultimate objective. For a few hours, the German plan seemed vindicated, but Peiper knew better. He had been in Belgium before, in 1940, when German panzers had raced to the English Channel in a lightning campaign that stunned the world. Then, German logistics had functioned. German industry had been intact. German armies had faced enemies still mobilizing for war. In 1940, a daring armored thrust through the Ardennes had changed the history. This was not 1940. The roads were the same, but everything else had changed. In 1940, it had taken Peiper's division 9 hours to reach Stavelot from the German border. Now, in 1944, it had taken 36 hours to cover the same distance. The roads were congested. The Americans were fighting back. The fuel was running out. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies in 1940, was nowhere to be seen. The overwhelming advantages of 1940 had evaporated, replaced by the grinding mathematics of industrial attrition. Peiper's advance from Büllingen would carry Kampfgruppe Peiper forward for only a few more days. They would capture Stavelot but arrive too late to seize the massive fuel depots near Spa before Americans evacuated or destroyed them. They would find that American engineers had blown the bridges at Trois Ponts, blocking their route to the Meuse. They would discover that American infantry, armor, and artillery were converging on their positions from multiple directions. By December 19th, just 2 days after capturing the Büllingen depot, Peiper would realize his Kampfgruppe had insufficient fuel to continue advancing. His reconnaissance units had missed American Fuel Depot Number 2, containing over 2.2 million gallons, by less than a mile. Had they found it, the Battle of the Bulge might have unfolded very differently. But they didn't find it because American defenders and Belgian resistance members were already destroying or evacuating fuel stocks throughout the region. On December 22nd, a Luftwaffe aerial resupply attempt would fail spectacularly, with 90% of fuel canisters falling outside Peiper's defensive perimeter and into American hands. By December 23rd, Peiper would face the decision he had been dreading since the offensive began. His Kampfgruppe was out of fuel, cut off from German lines, surrounded by American forces, and had no prospect of relief or resupply. On Christmas Eve, Peiper would give the order to abandon all vehicles and attempt to escape on foot. His men would destroy their own tanks, those magnificent Tiger IIs and Panthers and Panzer C4s, using demolition charges to ensure the Americans couldn't capture them intact. Of the 4,800 men who had begun the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, only about 800 would make it back to German lines, exhausted, beaten, having accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty lists and confirming what the mathematical reality had always indicated. The Ardennes offensive would grind on for several more weeks, but its failure was inevitable from the moment it began. By January 25, 1945, American and British forces would retake all the ground lost in the initial German attacks. The bulge in Allied lines would be eliminated. German forces would retreat behind the Siegfried Line, having expended fuel, vehicles, and manpower they could not replace, having postponed the inevitable for perhaps a few more months. The strategic consequences were catastrophic for Germany. The Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last operational reserves. Over 100,000 German soldiers became casualties, including many experienced tank crews, officers, and veterans who represented irreplaceable combat leadership. Approximately 800 tanks and hundreds of aircraft were lost, losses that German industry could no longer replace. The fuel expended on the offensive represented months of synthetic fuel production. And what had Germany achieved? A temporary bulge in Allied lines, quickly eliminated. A few weeks' delay in Allied offensive operations. Some Allied casualties, painful but ultimately manageable for nations with the industrial capacity to replace losses. The Ardennes offensive had not split the Allied armies. It had not recaptured Antwerp. It had not forced the Western Allies to negotiate. It had accomplished nothing except confirming what Joachim Peiper had understood while standing in Büllingen on December 17th, watching American fuel flow into German tanks. Germany had lost the war, not because German soldiers lacked courage, not because German tanks were inferior, though by 1944, American and Soviet armor was rapidly closing the quality gap, not because German generals lacked tactical skill. Germany had lost because it was fighting an industrial war without adequate industrial capacity. It was fighting a war of logistics without a functional logistics system. It was fighting enemies who could absorb horrific losses and continue attacking, while Germany could not afford a single major defeat. The fuel depot at Büllingen symbolized everything wrong with Germany's strategic position. The Germans could capture enemy supplies, but only through desperate offensive actions. They could refuel their vehicles, but only by using enemy resources. They could continue fighting, but only by delaying the inevitable. The Americans, by contrast, had built a supply system so robust that losing 50,000 gallons of fuel at Büllingen barely registered. First Army maintained millions of gallons in reserve. Behind those reserves stood the United States petroleum industry, producing more fuel in a month than Germany could synthesize in a year. Behind that industry stood a nation with the world's largest economy, mobilized for war but not yet fully mobilized, still capable of expanding production if needed. German prisoners of war marched past American supply dumps in the weeks following the Ardennes offensive, expressed astonishment at the scale of Allied logistics. One captured officer, whose identity was recorded only as a colonel in post-war interrogation reports, reportedly said, while being marched past an American supply depot, "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." He was exactly right. The Battle of the Bulge, like World War II more broadly, was what Germans called material Schlacht, material battle. It was a contest of industrial economies, and Germany's industrial economy was vastly inferior to the combined might of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. By 1944, the Allies were outproducing the Axis in every major category of military production. Aircraft, tanks, vehicles, ships, ammunition, everything required to wage modern industrial war. Joachim Peiper survived the war. He was captured in May 1945 and tried for war crimes, specifically for the Malmedy massacre on December 17, 1944, when elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper had murdered 84 American prisoners of war at the Bagnères crossroads. Peiper was convicted and sentenced to death, though that sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment and then reduced further. He was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956. After his release, Peiper worked as a car salesman and later as a translator. He moved to France, attempting to live quietly under an assumed identity. In July 1976, his identity was discovered by former French resistance members. On July 14th, his house was attacked and set on fire. Joachim Peiper died in the flames, killed by the same war he had fought 3 decades earlier. In interviews and interrogations after the war, Peiper reportedly maintained his conviction in Nazi ideology, remaining largely unrepentant for his actions. But in conversations with American officers during his captivity, he acknowledged what he had understood even during the Ardennes Offensive. Germany had been fighting a war it could not win. The fuel situation alone made victory impossible. The industrial disparities between Germany and the Allies were insurmountable. Major Hal McCown, an American officer captured by Peiper during the Battle of the Bulge and held prisoner in La Glaise, had long conversations with the German commander. Despite Peiper's expressions of confidence in Germany's ability to continue fighting, McCown noted in his post-liberation reports that Peiper seemed to understand the mathematical reality of Germany's situation. He spoke of new SS divisions being formed, of secret weapons, of determination to fight to the last. But his actions, the decision to abandon his vehicles and retreat rather than fight to annihilation, suggested a more pragmatic understanding of military reality. The 50,000 gallons captured at Büllingen had bought Kampfgruppe Peiper perhaps 30 additional hours of mobile operations. Those hours had not changed the outcome of the Ardennes Offensive. They had not altered the trajectory of the war. They had simply postponed the inevitable by the smallest imaginable margin. The real significance of Büllingen was not the fuel captured, but the story it told about the fundamental imbalance between German and American logistical capabilities. That small depot in a Belgian town, holding enough fuel to seem like salvation to desperate German forces, represented a logistical system of almost incomprehensible scale. Behind Büllingen stood Spa, holding millions of gallons. Behind Spa stood the port of Antwerp. Behind Antwerp stood the Atlantic supply lines. Behind those stood American petroleum production, American manufacturing, American industrial might. Germany was trying to fight that system, with synthetic fuel plants being bombed into rubble, with horses pulling artillery, with instructions to steal enemy supplies to continue offensive operations. It was a strategy of desperation masquerading as operational planning. Modern military historians continue to debate various aspects of the Battle of the Bulge. Could different German tactical decisions have produced different outcomes? What if Peiper had turned north at Büllingen instead of continuing west, potentially trapping 2 American divisions? What if German engineers had cleared roads more efficiently? What if the weather had prevented Allied air support for longer? These are interesting tactical questions, but they miss the strategic reality that Joachim Peiper understood on December 17, 1944. Tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic impossibility. Better road clearance would not solve Germany's fundamental fuel shortage. Trapping American divisions would not address the fact that America could raise, train, and equip new divisions faster than Germany could destroy them. No tactical victory in the Ardennes could alter the mathematics of industrial production that made German defeat inevitable. The United States produced approximately 300,000 aircraft during World War II. Germany produced around 120,000. The United States manufactured over 88,000 tanks. Germany built approximately 50,000 armored vehicles of all types. American shipyards launched over 2,700 Liberty ships alone during the war, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. These production figures represented not just numerical superiority, but a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy and capacity. American industry operated on principles of mass production, standardization, and efficiency that German industry never fully embraced. When American factories needed to expand production, they built new factories. When they needed more workers, they recruited women, African Americans, and other previously underutilized populations. When they needed raw materials, they accessed a continental economy rich in every resource necessary for modern industry. When they needed to move goods, they had the world's most extensive railroad network and the most developed highway system. Germany, by contrast, was fighting a multi-front war while conducting industrial production under near-constant Allied bombing. Raw materials were in short supply, transportation networks were being systematically destroyed, the workforce was being depleted by military conscription and casualties. Slave labor, brutally exploited from the concentration camps and occupied territories, provided a partial solution, but could never match the productivity of properly trained, motivated workers in American factories. The 50,000 gallons at Büllingen told this entire story in miniature. Here was fuel produced by an American petroleum industry with access to essentially unlimited crude oil, refined in American plants, operating at peacetime efficiency levels, transported across the Atlantic in American tankers, moved through European ports and depots by American trucks, staged forward in Belgian towns as a matter of routine logistics. That single depot represented a supply chain spanning thousands of miles and involving hundreds of thousands of workers, all functioning with systematic efficiency. Germany could capture that depot through tactical excellence. Peiper's forces were superb soldiers, and they executed their mission with professional skill, but capturing one depot could not address the systemic logistical disadvantage Germany faced. For every depot Germany captured, the Allies had 10 more. For every gallon of fuel Germany seized, Allied industry produced hundreds more. For every German victory, the mathematics of industrial war indicated a dozen future defeats. This was the terrible knowledge that Joachim Peiper carried away from Büllingen. He had captured the fuel his Kampfgruppe desperately needed. His tanks were refueled. His vehicles could continue advancing. And absolutely none of it mattered because the war was already lost. Not lost in the sense that Germany had been defeated on the battlefield that day. Lost in the sense that the mathematical realities of industrial warfare made German victory impossible. 3 more years of fighting after Büllingen would not change this reality. Germany could develop new weapons, the Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, advanced U-boats. Germany could fight with desperate courage, as soldiers always do when their homeland is threatened. Germany could inflict terrible casualties on Allied forces. None of it would matter, because Germany could not match Allied industrial production. The most poignant aspect of the Battle of the Bulge is perhaps this. Germany committed its last reserves, expended its remaining fuel, sacrificed thousands of experienced soldiers in a desperate gamble. The offensive failed. And when it was over, Allied forces were stronger, not weaker. American industry simply produced more trucks, more tanks, more fuel, more ammunition. The Red Ball Express trucked more supplies forward. Replacement divisions arrived from the United States. The Allied supply system absorbed the disruption and continued functioning. Germany, by contrast, never recovered from the Ardennes Offensive. The forces committed to that attack were the last significant mobile reserves Germany possessed. When they were destroyed or captured, there were no replacements. German industry could not build new tanks fast enough to replace losses. Synthetic fuel production continued its collapse under Allied bombing. The pool of experienced soldiers shrank with every battle. Germany's military capacity decreased with every passing month, even as Allied strength continued to grow. If you want to understand why Germany lost World War II, you could study grand strategy, political ideology, diplomatic relationships, technological development. All of these factors mattered, but you could also just look at the fuel depot at Büllingen, 50,000 gallons, enough to save Peiper's advance for one more day. And behind those 50,000 gallons stood the entire apparatus of American industrial might, producing millions of gallons more, shipping it across the Atlantic, moving it to forward depots, making it available to Allied forces as a matter of routine logistics. Germany was trying to fight that system with instructions to capture enemy supplies and horses pulling artillery wagons. The outcome was never in doubt. Joachim Peiper understood this on December 17, 1944. The fuel he captured would buy him one more day of operations, perhaps two, but it could not buy victory. Victory required industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, and resource access on a scale that Germany simply did not possess and could never develop while fighting a multi-front war against enemies who already held overwhelming advantages. The German officer who seized 50,000 gallons of American fuel had achieved a tactical success, but in that moment of triumph, examining the scale and organization of American logistics even in a small Belgian town, he understood the terrible truth. Germany had already lost the war. Everything that followed was just the long, bloody process of confirming what the mathematics had always indicated. As you watch history documentaries or read about World War II battles, remember this. The decisive factor in modern industrial warfare is not courage, not tactics, not even technology. It is productive capacity. It is logistics. It is the ability to move fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment from factories to battlefields with systematic efficiency. The nation that can do this best, that can outproduce and outsupply its enemies, that nation will win. In World War II, that nation was the United States, and every German officer who captured an American supply depot, who saw the scale and organization of Allied logistics, who understood what those supplies represented, knew that Germany had lost the war. Joachim Peiper was simply among the first to articulate that knowledge, even if he did so only in the privacy of his own thoughts while watching American fuel flow into German tanks on a cold December morning in Belgium. If you found this deep dive into World War II logistics and strategic realities fascinating, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more historical content that goes beyond the usual battle narratives to explore the deeper factors that determine history's outcomes. History is not just about who won which battles. It's about understanding why the war was won or lost. Before the first shot was fired,